Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for waiting. I would like to welcome you all once again at today's live webcast. This webinar is the last of the 3 sessions in joint partnership with Testhouse, Microsoft, and Comparative. So far, we've shown you the capability of MTM and exploratory testing. And last week, we showed you how to automate tests using coded UI for automation. For today's webinar, we will be looking at web performance testing. My colleague will be presenting an overview of web performance testing. We will also be looking at recording simple web tests, delving through to think times, data parameters, and rules. I am proud to be joined today by my colleague Peter Manwaring, our Visual Studio consultant for Testhouse. The presentation will last roughly 40 minutes and Q&A at the end of the session. Before I pass you over to my colleague Peter, again, please feel free to type in your individual questions on the Q&A pod now or during the presentation. We will answer most of your questions if time allows. A full screen at the top of your slides is also available, which is useful when Peter, my colleague, will run his demos this afternoon. So without further delay, I now pass you over to my colleague Peter.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Testhouse webinar on load testing. So just a very quick word about Testhouse. I know some of you are returning. We're a company formed in 2000. We're an IT company who concentrates purely on the QA testing side of things. We have many consultants around, and a world presence in India as well as Europe and, of course, the US. So if you have any kind of questions or queries about software quality or testing in the ALM that you think you need help with, just get in touch. Here's just a list of some of our clients we've worked with in the past. You can see from this list quite a variety of different sizes of companies and also in different areas from entertainment to financial. So we have quite a broad base of experience. Moving on to today's topic, web and load. I'll just quickly run through what we'll be talking about today. Understanding web performance tests, just to give a little bit of a background about what they're for and basically how they work. There's some demos as well. I'll be looking at how to record and set up a simple web test and then how to run one. Talking a little bit about how you can edit it to make it more realistic and make it do more advanced things and realistic things. How to make your simulation. The whole point of these web tests is trying to get a simulation of a user using a web interface. So if you can get a realistic simulation, then that's what you're aiming for. Talking a little bit about dynamic parameters, what they are, how to deal with them, and then some extraction and validation rules as well. To say how you can modify the test to make sure that things are working the way you expect them to. And then a Q&A session at the end. So understanding web tests, what they're all about. If you know about how web interfaces work and web technology works, the web test works at the HTTP layer. That simply means it's just intercepting messages that flow from the browser, from the client to the web server. So it's looking at the actual communication as it's sent to and fro from the client and the server. As you do your recording, it will record time and data as well. So it'll take into account how long you're using on a particular page, for example. So it tries to build that into the interface as well. So when you're recording your tests, you have to be aware of that. Although you can go back and change that later, and we're looking at a bit later. One thing that it doesn't do is run any client-side scripting, like Java, for instance. If you've got anything clever going on for your user experience, that is not really what we're looking at in web testing. The web testing really aims to look at how fast the communication is between the client and the server. So any client-side scripting is really not going to be included in that. It wouldn't be useful to measure how fast the browser takes to execute a certain script, for example, because that is not going to be useful to this exercise. Now, when you have a web test, it's generally then used to replicate a load test. We have a lot of virtual users, and they can be put up onto your server to hit your web server altogether. So you can have 50, 100 users, and then you can take readings to see how your web is standing up to that. So it's a cut-down version of the browser that actually runs. You don't have a fully blown browser doing all these users. Otherwise, that would very quickly eat up all the resources on your system. So it's just a very, very cut-down version of a browser. Some things that are captured, well, query strings and form parameters, hidden form fields, those things are all captured. Anything that's useful to actually run the website from the browser and the communication between the browser and the server. Things that are not captured are things like images, Cascade sheets, JavaScript, as I've mentioned, things which are very nice for the user to see and makes the user experience much more rich, but not to be included in the timings between the server and the browser, as that's what we're trying to measure in this exercise if you go into load testing. And all the redirects are followed during the run as well. So you can have redirects if you have them in your website, which they usually do these days. So it's going to have a demo now of recording a basic web test. Okay, so you can see it's really quite simple. Quickly share. Right, here we go. Right, so we've got Visual Studio open, and we say File, New, and we need to create a new project, as all testing efforts are now kept within projects within Visual Studio. So we'll give the project a meaningful name, call it Training, okay? And then if we just hit OK, the system will create a web test project for us sitting inside the training solution. Now, it's a good idea to have all your testing and development going on inside one solution, keeps them all together. And so what the system does for you, which you can see here, if you just press record, it pops up a browser. But what happens is it opens for you an empty web test. And what you have to do then is actually make a recording which will actually populate the web test. And then you make a recording, and later on you can adapt that recording and edit that recording, and then you can go back and replay it. That's the whole point. So you hit record, and you should see this screen. On the left-hand side, you can see a recorder. You can pause it. You can make a recording, some new recording. You can pause the recording anytime. You can stop your recording, or you can add a comment, or you can clear all requests if you think you need to go back and start again. Okay. Comments, they're quite important. If you don't see the recorder on the left-hand side, you need to activate a plugin on the browser, okay, which is which will recognise as a recorder. So you have to make sure that is turned on if you don't see the web test recorder on the left-hand side of the browser when you hit the record button. So the first thing we can do is hit record, or we can hit. Always a good idea to have a comment first, and it's a good idea to comment as you go along. Otherwise, it's very easy to get lost. All you end up with is a load of requests in your web test, and it's very difficult to see where you are without these comments. So when you try and do something, put in a comment. That's always good advice. So we've got a test website here called Tailspin Toys. So I just launched it, and you can see straight away there that it's recorded the tailspintoys.com request. So we add another comment. So you can add another comment just to say what's going on during your well, as you go along, you add comments. I can see you might have well, I can see it's So we had a few issues with the video, but it seems to be just a bit behind time now. So what we've done there, we've made a recording. We've said OK, and what the system is doing now is it's looking for what's called dynamic parameters within your recording. OK, I'll be talking more about dynamic parameters later, but it just tries to automatically find some dynamic parameters for you, things that might change throughout the recording. So you see here you have a list of requests that have been recorded for you, okay, which you can go and change. But you can see you've got some redirects there. You've also got some form parameters which you can look at and you can manipulate. Okay, so if we go back to the slides. Okay, so back on the slide. So I hope you got the idea of how recording web test goes. If you were here last time for the Coded UI, it's a similar kind of idea. You do a recording, and then you can play with the recording and then play it back at a later time. So running a web test, okay, when you run your web test, you get certain information back. You get basically two panes, as it were, two windows. And on the top window, you'll be able to see your requests, whether any errors came up and failed, okay, or whether they passed. So it just gives you an idea of how the test is progressing. The most useful, and also it gives you information about how long that individual request took to process, how many bytes were sent from or to the server. Okay, so it's good useful information already. On the bottom pane, you will have some more information. You have a cut-down web browser. You will have information about the request, information about the response that's come back. Okay, you can see the HTML. You can see also context, which is like all the variables that are available to you to use in the recording, and also you'll be able to see details of what happened, whether it passed or failed, and if it failed, why it failed. Okay, so we can have a quick demonstration of that, of running your web test. Okay, running a performance web test. So we've got our web test and we're now going to try and play it back. Right, so all we can do is right-click anywhere in the test and say Run Test, or we've got this drop-down on the menu where we can run the test. We can also debug the test, which means you can step through it one at a time. I haven't got time to show you that, but if you have issues with your test, you can debug it. And you can pause before starting as well to make sure that if you're doing a load test, then all your infrastructure is in place. But we'll just run it. And you can see it's quite simple, so it's going through quite quickly. So you can see the requests we've got. They've got ticks by the side of them. That means they've succeeded in a way. In other words, the server has actually come back with a web page to display. As you can see here, you've got 2000 status, which is OK in the code. You can see the total time it took, the request time, so how long it took to actually send the request out. If we're doing things like web services, you send out a request in to the web service, and this would show you how many bytes are within that web service request. Okay, if you're doing web services, and response bytes, how many bytes are actually in the response page that came back. So you can see all of that information at the top. At the bottom, we've got the browser. Now, as I mentioned before, when it reruns the test, it's not a full browser that it's using. Okay, it's a cut-down version of a browser. So you can't expect to see an exact rendering of what you would see when you're actually recording the test. So you can see in this example, you've got some diagrams and you've got some text, but it's not laid out in the fashion that it would be in a real browser. But as I mentioned before, we're not really after the full user experience. We're only interested in making sure that the communication is working properly at this stage. So don't expect to see everything that you would see in a normal browser. You can play back in different browsers, by the way, but you must record in IE. So other tabs, you've got the request, information about the request you sent out. So you've got information about anything in the header, query string parameters that were sent over when the user made a selection on the screen, for example. You can look at the HTML of the response, so you get the full HTML of the response, which is important for checking that you're getting exactly back from the server what you expect to get back. There are ways of doing verification on that, which I can look at a bit later. You can view the HTML in a proper HTML viewer, so you get good color coding there, and you can see very clearly if there's any issues with the HTML that you're getting back from the server. You can look at the context. This is a list of all the variables, and there's quite a few set up for you. But there are ways that you can extract information from a request, and you can set up your own variables. You can see you've got agent ID here, for example, the name of the computer, which is VS2013. Okay, if you're running on different agents over a rig or a network, you can see different information about that appearing on the screen automatically. And at the bottom here, you've got things like the user ID, the web user ID, and how many agents we're using. But you can put more information at the back. If the system detects any dynamic parameters, okay, it will add those parameters into the end as well for you to see. Anything that might change, like a usage ID. And then the details. So it says here you've got response URL is correct, and response time goal has been passed. Now, these are automatically verification rules which I put in for you. The response URL just says, am I getting the same URL back as I did during the recording? I am in this case. And response time goal just says, is the page being rendered in a reasonable amount of time? Okay, and these two things you can change as well. So these two things are under your control as a tester. Okay. So that's running a simple ID. Okay, so editing the performance test then, I can just give you a quick run through of what you have available. Once you have your test in place, there's quite a lot you can do to modify it to get it to do exactly what you want to do. You've already seen the run button. This is the menu across the top of the screen that you've seen. So you've already seen the run drop down. You can debug through that as well, and the add recording button. Okay, so when you want to add a recording, when you use the add recording button, it adds a recording to the end of the recording you've already got. If anywhere inside the recording you right-click and add a recording, you can insert a recording, as it were, inside the test at any point that you choose. Just a word of caution when you do that, of course. If you start doing that, you should check your playbacks very carefully, because things might not kind of fit together exactly correctly if you don't do all of your recording in one go. So if you do that, then just check it carefully. You can add a data source very easily. So you can for a common usage of this, of course, is user login and password. So you can go around and change the login password every time, and run the same test under different users. That's a very common thing to do. So very often in these scenarios, you need to set up a big data file with different users and IDs and passwords. You can set credentials for a server. This is not used so much, but if you try and log into, if the system tries to log into a server that needs some sort of authentication, Windows authentication, you can set some credentials in the window that pops up to give it access to that particular machine. Okay, not the same thing as logging into your website. Now, the next two buttons are a web test plugin button and web request plugin button. These are more advanced topics which we haven't got time to talk about today. But what you can do is, when you get onto this stage, you can write what's called a plugin, which will change the way that the system runs when it does a test for you. And you can write them in C#. So if you know C# or some other languages, then you can do things like write output to a file, for example. You can, if an error comes up which you know is not really an error, you can write a bit of code which circumvents that, so you don't get errors all the time cropping up in your code. And you can write them so the whole test overall is changed, or you can write them against individual requests, so only the functioning of that particular request is changed by your custom code. Okay, that's a whole kind of couple of hours work on the course just to give you the basics of that, so I don't have to talk about that during this webinar. The next button is generate code. What you can also do is you can take your recording, hit this button, and the system will generate some code for you. Okay, this is quite useful if you try and do custom code, because it allows you to see how certain things are achieved within code. Okay, that's one good use for it. It also allows you to go in there and make coding modifications quite easily, and then you can run that as well. Again, you need some technical expertise on how coding works, but that's something to explore. Parameterized web services is always a very good idea to run that as soon as you have completed recording a test, because the test may go off and talk to more than one server, for example. And then to actually get the information that needs to stay to the client. And then if you want to go and run your test on a different network or a different environment, you would have to go through and you would have to manually change all of the calls to all those different servers, okay, which is quite a tiresome job, as you can imagine. But if you parameterize your web services, it puts all those web servers into variables, okay? So you just have to change the variable in one place in the test, and then that will allow you to go and run your test in different networks and environments, very simply. And it just appears in the context list of variables, which you've seen already. So that's always quite recommended to do that when you finish recording a web test. Promote dynamic parameters, you've seen, that happens automatically when the system finishes recording a test. But if you hit this button, it will do it again for you to see if it can find any others. Okay. Dynamic parameters, it doesn't do a brilliant job at finding these dynamic parameters, especially since web sites are getting more and more complicated. It's something you probably have to deal with yourself manually, and I'll be talking more in depth about this a bit later anyway. And set request details. Every request has a think time and also has a response time. Okay, think times we'll be looking at later. The response time is measured in seconds, and if this page doesn't come back within that response time that you can set individually for each response or each request, then it will flag up an error. But that can be changed when you change your tests. Okay, so you can use this tool to check that you're getting good response times. So as I said, when you're creating these web tests, what you're really aiming to do is create an accurate simulation of a web test to use later within a load test. Okay, and one of the major influences of doing that is your think times. Okay, what if you define your think times and attach a think time to any request, the system will basically pause for that number of seconds before moving on to the next one. And it's designed to simulate a user reading a page or thinking about a page before he or she moves on. It's no good having a simulation when you're testing your web servers that just goes through the test at breakneck speed when that's not realistic. When that's not what happens when the users use the web page in reality. So think times allow you to add that in and simulate what users really do. They are recorded during a web test, during your recording of the web test, but then you'll probably want to go back and change those after the event, after you've thought about how long a user would typically stay on a particular web page. Okay, so that's easily done. And you can use them optionally during playback. You can turn them on and off. So if you want to just check your test to make sure that no errors are coming back, you can turn off your think times and run through. And then when you want to check that you've got a realistic model of what's going on, you can turn your think times back on again, and then you can gauge whether it's a realistic simulation or not. But think times are quite important when it comes to modelling a correct or realistic scenario. There are basically two ways of editing your think times, okay? There's this way, which is attached to every request. So if you right-click and look at the properties of a request, you'll get the right-hand side information. One of the things you'll see are think times, so you can update that figure, okay? That's how to do it in a request-by-request basis. But if you remember a few slides ago when I was talking about updating or editing a web test, the very right-hand side button, okay, if you press that, you get a table with all your requests, which has the think time and the response time for every request. So you can change it very quickly on a table basis, rather by looking at this individually, one by one. So we'll have a demonstration of how to set up these think times, because they are quite important to, if you want to use these to do load tests, it's quite important. Okay, so now you can see we've got a recording, and I right-clicked on a request, and you can see over the right-hand side I looked at the properties, so you can see I've got a think time of 7 seconds on this particular request that I'm looking at, okay, but I can look at another one. Okay, so I can right-click that, look at the properties, and I can see think time is 7 seconds. I can update that if I want to. Okay, just look at one more, and it's recorded. So this recorded value is the actual time that was taken when the recording took place. But you can update them very easily just in this interface. So if I go ahead and run the test now, okay, you can see actually. It's not taking notice of the think times. It's just going straight through. Okay, and that's because you have to do something else before it will actually take the think times into consideration. Okay, so if I look at Edit Run Settings, okay, then you have this window where you can do several things. You can change, and it's effective for this particular tab, okay, or that particular session. Okay, so I can change the fixed run count, so I can run it for 2 times if I want to. I can change the browser that it runs back, or I can click the Simulate Think Times button, click box. Now, if I click to here to run again, this time it's going to actually pause for that think time that we set up. So it's thinking for, and then a countdown, 7 seconds, 6, 5, 4. So it counts down and just pauses there until the think time is up and then moves on to the next. Okay? And so this is important if you go and you try and use this in a web load test. You want to make sure your simulated users are doing a realistic interaction with your website. Otherwise, the readings you get from that load test are not going to be realistic. They're going to be way too low, and you're going to think you've got a really fast website, when in fact a realistic simulation would say that maybe it's not so fast. Also, within that simulation, it actually went around twice. So you have two. It went around twice, and because I clicked 2 for the loops, so you can actually perform your web test more than one time. Okay, dynamic parameters. These are tricky little things, okay, which you have to deal with eventually if you use web testing in your web development lifecycle. And what they are. Within a web session, you have certain parameters which may change from one session to another, okay, but are consistent inside that session. Some kind of identification string which the server uses to identify this particular session would be a good example. Now, when you record your test, you're recording one particular value of this parameter, okay? So then when you replicate your tests and finally run them, this particular value is going to be inserted in every one of those, and your server is going to get very, very confused because it thinks it's got multiple versions of the same session going on, okay? So what you have to do is you have to track down these dynamic parameters in the responses of your test. You have to extract them using the extraction rule, which I'll be looking at. Okay, and then you have to store that information inside one of your context parameters, and then you can insert that parameter inside your request at the relevant time, so the server knows what session it's dealing with. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So it's one of the more trickier parts of web performance testing. As I say, the system tries to detect automatically some of these parameters for you, but you almost definitely have to detect some of them yourself. So what dynamic parameters are detected for you? You've got some hidden fields on the HTML pages, some ASP.NET view states. If you understand how websites work, then you know that some of these have to be dealt with. Query string from the post parameters. These can be detected as well and brought out so you can manipulate them when the test is actually being recorded. Okay, so some of these have to be looked at, and it's something that you just get better at with experience. You get to look at a certain string and think, oh, that looks like it could be a dynamic parameter. You can take that and you can see where it fits in. Again, this is a major part of the course. When we do a course on this, we spend a good while trying to learn how to deal with these dynamic parameters. But for now, I just have time to give you the theory of what they are and basically how you have to deal with them. So in order to deal with dynamic parameters, you have to know how to use extraction rules. So that's the next video, the next demonstration, how to actually deal with extraction rules. You can use extraction rules for various uses. You can actually extract a piece of information and put it in a context parameter to use later. You can extract it to compare it to something else to make sure you've got the correct page showing up, although there are a special class of rule called a verification rule, which we can look at a bit later. There are many different types of extraction rule. I'll be running through what they are, and you can write your own. If you need a special type of rule or to get some information out of a page, and it isn't covered by your inbuilt types that come with Visual Studio, you can write your own kind of rule and add that into the system. Okay, so if you can program it, then you can have it as a rule. Okay, and that's also true of verification rules as well, which we'll be looking at a bit later. Here's a quick list which a demonstration runs through. So I'll just explain on the video exactly what the different options are and what they mean. So here's a demo for an extraction rule of how to put a rule in. So we're going to open up Visual Studio and we'll take a look at a recording that's been done, and we're going to add a extraction rule into one of these requests. Now you can do it on a request by request basis, so you can right click on the request and say add an extraction rule, and it will come up with a list of all the different kind of extraction rules that are available to you as default, out of the box as it were. So you can have select an option. So if you've got a drop down or something like that, you can look at the contents of a drop down and take that into a context variable. If you know about HTML, you've got your inner text tag. Okay, so you can specify the tag and then you can get the text from a tag. An attribute value. that you can get those. Form fields are often automatically exposed to you in the listing, but you can actually get those as well. You can get information from a HTTP header as well, from extraction rule, and get that so you can use it later. You can use a regular expression on the whole of the return, or the most common one is the extract text. And then you just say it starts with this, it ends with that, and it'll extract the text in between. You can ignore case, you can use regular expression. You can also index it as well, which is quite useful. So if there are several times that this particular text exists on a return, okay, then you can take the first one or the second one or the third one. You're not stuck with just taking the first one, in other words. Or you can take a random match. So the system will look at them all and just take a random selection, if that's something you want to do. You can also decode HTML. So if the code has been changed from HTML into some other code, you can decode it back into ordinary text, and then you can take that and use it later on in the test. So that's a quick look through. But what I'm going to do is use a slightly different technique to do an extraction rule. So I'm going to run the test first. Quickly run the test. And that will just come through, and it will give me an opportunity to look at a response, and then I can show you how you can quickly set up a rule to get what you need from that response out into a context variable. Because remember, you need these context variables that you can plug that information in later on. Or you just want to look and see what's inside a tag and then use that later on. So I'm going to look at a certain request, and I'm going to look at in the response of that request, the HTML response. And I'm going to try and get some information out of there into my programs so I can use it later on. So if I look down in the body, okay, I can see, right, I can choose which text I'm interested in. So let's say, for instance, home tailspin toys. And it sits in between the title tags, as you can see there, okay? So that could be some sort of code that might change on a basis of when you run the test. So I want to add an extraction rule to get that particular text out, okay? So it says it automatically creates an extraction rule for me, which you can see on the left-hand side there. It's been highlighted, and it's going to extract it to a parameter called param0 as a default name. But I can change that to anything I want later on. So if I highlight that and look at the properties, see exactly what it's done for us. It's extracting to param0. It sees that the text starts with this title, okay? But then I'd probably go in there myself and make that more explicit, okay? So otherwise you're going to get may get some false positives. By default it takes 5 characters, but I would recommend you need more, so I'd go in there and I'd just extend that a bit to make it more likely that it is going to get exactly the text that I need. Again, you've got your index, so you can take the first or second, okay? So with that set up, let's run the test again. And see if it actually extracts the data and what it looks like within the variables that have been extracted. So now if I go to the context and move down, okay, I can see I've got param0, and that's home tailspin toys. Okay. Now imagine that could be some sort of code which changes from one session to another. Okay. I need to grab that code so that I can push it back to the server, and so the server knows which session is active. If I've got 100 users, let's say, in a load test, that's something you actually need to do. Otherwise, your tests will not run properly. So we'll close down that session, okay, and I can make some changes to the test, which will change slightly the way that these things work. So if I just right-click that and say, look at the properties, I will change the name to make it more meaningful, always something that's recommended. I'm not going to take the first one now. I'm going to take the second one. Remember, it's a zero-based numbering system, so 0 means the first, 1 means the second. Okay, quite common in computers, but can be a bit confusing. So run it again, and we'll get a slightly different result this time. But you can see you can easily change these rules to do exactly what you want them to do. Okay, so if we look at the context now, we can see that the name has changed to title, okay, and the system has picked up something a little bit different this time because it's not picked up the first one, it's picked up the second one. So it's picked up a slightly different string, okay? That's something you've got to be aware of in your HTML, just to make sure you get exactly the right rule that you need. But that has picked up the information and put it in a context variable for you. So that's extraction rules, but are quite an important subject within testing. So we'll just quickly move back to the slides then. There are another kind of rule called validation rule, which I'll just talk about for a little while. A validation on a response is just a way to make sure that the response is valid and is what you expect to come back from the server as a web page. So again, you get some of the same kind of options. You can look for an inner tag to make sure that if you know that there's a bit of HTML which should come back on the page, you can check that it's there. You can also check the response time goal. As I mentioned, you can change that to make sure that the page comes back in a time which you think is acceptable. You can find a certain text to make sure that a certain bit of text you expect to be on that page is there. You can also set up universal validation rules. So you can set up a rule so that it checks every single web page to come back. So if you've got some kind of text which is standard on every single web page, you can make sure that it is on every single web page by making a universal validation rule. And response URL we've already touched upon. It's just a way to make sure that when you have a response, the URL which is accessed is the same URL as was in the recording to make sure that your linkages work properly, all your links work. But again, that's changeable, okay? So if you have a test which may go down different routes in your website, then you can actually attach it to data driving as well. So you can make sure that you've got the correct URL coming back no matter which way down the website you navigate. Okay, so there are various options there, and you can make them universal or applied to just a certain request. Okay, but once you apply them to universally, you can't overwrite them. So if you have just one page which has a different verification, okay, which isn't valid for all the others, then you can't override a universal rule just for that one exception, unfortunately. Okay, not at the moment anyway. Okay, so that concludes my demonstration for today for web testing, but there's just one or two other things to mention, particularly this thing called DTDPS, which is for Developer Tools Deployment Planning Services. Every time you buy a license from Microsoft, okay, they give you these points, which you can then use for consultancy. And one of the plans that they have is this thing called DTDPS. So if you buy Visual Studio, let's say, or Team Foundation Server, you will get automatically several days of consultancy depending on what level of license that you buy. And then organizations like Test House can come in and we can give you advice about how to use the tool, as well as things like other consultancy opportunities like testing or one-to-one guidance, mentoring with your staff, that kind of thing. We also do all kinds of consulting as well and training both on the web, which you've seen today, and also other aspects of testing, particularly in Microsoft. So I will now pass you back to Melanie, who will take some questions and answers.
Thank you, Peter. As Peter mentioned, we will now be taking Q&A. Before that, here are some additional resources that you can find from Test House. So we are on LinkedIn. We've got different groups, as you see on the screen. We are on Twitter. We are on Microsoft Pinpoint, and we also are on YouTube for Visual Studio-related videos. So we're running a few minutes late. We will take 2 or 3 questions and then maybe take some of them offline. So please feel free to type in your questions on your Q&A pod below the slide deck. So let's take a few questions now. So the first question is, can you use more than one data source to control a web test?
Yeah, in web tests you actually can. I did last week one on coded UI, and you can only use one source to drive your coded UI. But in web testing, it's a different story. You can define more than one data source, be it a file or from a database. And once they're defined, they're sitting there for you, and you can plug them in different places where you need to quite simply. Particularly useful on form feeds, forms where you might want the simulated user to choose different things, to send your website down a different path, or to display different kinds of information. So you can have, for instance, a separate one for your login and one that drives the navigation, for example. So yeah, you can. Didn't have time to show you today, but that's a very powerful technique.
Second question, can you write output to logs while the test is running?
Yes, it's a little bit more of an advanced topic. Remember I talked about those plugins, and you can write plugins in C#, for example, and you can associate those plugins either on a universal basis for the whole test, or you can associate them with an individual request. Well, if you know how to code it in C#, you can code it and you can affect the way the tests work. So you can have access to your parameters, which I've shown you how they're made up with extraction rules, for example. So in your C# code, which you can write whatever you want to do, you can take those variables and you can write them to an external file, for example. But it's very, very flexible system. It's very, very customizable. If you know how to program in C# and you understand the framework, how to get access and control the framework, then you can do lots of different things.
Okay, thanks, Peter. We'll take the last question for this afternoon. Could you use a loop to simulate many users on a system performing the test at the same time?
Well, I really wouldn't advise doing things that way. You can definitely do loops within a web performance test, but really those loops are only to simulate the same user doing something multiple times, not to simulate multiple users doing things. Okay, it's quite a common mistake I see people make, but really a web test is one user doing one interaction through a website. Okay, and you just bear that in mind and you won't go wrong. If you want to simulate more than one user, which is quite common, then you can take the web test that you've made, turn it into a load test, which again is something inside Visual Studio, but it's something we haven't had time to look at during this session. Then you can have more than one test together, and you can change the mix of tests within a load test, and do lots of other things as well. But basically, you can have lots of virtual users sitting on your network, all working away with these web tests, all with their individual identities, and then you can monitor your system to see how it behaves. And basically, that's how you do multiple users within our load test.
Thank you, Guy. That concludes our Q&A session for this afternoon. Before we go, again, the recording will be available in the next couple of days. If you do have any further technical questions you would like to ask Peter, please do email him. His email address is on your screen right now. And if you want to know more about what Peter mentioned about our DTDPS offering, or if you wanted to know how many days DTDPS entitlements your company has, again, please feel free to email Peter or myself. Both our details are there. Thank you, Peter, for a valuable presentation today on web performance testing. Thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon, and we'll see you all again next time. Bye-bye.